Ribeyes are widely considered the greatest steak in the world, and for good reason. They're juicy, tender, and mega beefy. Today I'll be explaining everything there is to know about ribeyes, how to choose the right one, and how to cook it. We'll also finally be finding out how much extra you're paying for the bone on a tomahawk, and settle the debate once and for all, is that bone worth it? Let's get started. Okay, let's start by talking about the ribeye and where it comes from. So this right here is a whole choice grade rib roast, and it's actually the back strap of the cow. This part right here. And because of that, it's not a weight-bearing muscle, unlike something like the brisket, which holds up the weight of the cow. As a result, the ribeye is an extremely tender cut of beef. And there are two distinct sides of the rib roast. We have one side closer to the shoulder and the front of the animal, and the other side that's closer to the back. Let's start by talking about this side. This one's facing the shoulder and known as the chuck end. And as you can see, there are four distinct muscles within. This one here is known as the ribeye cap or the spinalis, and it's actually the most flavorful and premium cut on the entire cow. Next up, we have this little guy here called the complexus. This is actually part of the shoulder muscle and not super tender. Next up here, we have the eye of the ribeye, otherwise known as the longissimus dorsi. This is the biggest muscle on most ribeyes, very tender and flavorful. Last up, we have this guy here, which is the tail. It's pretty much just part of the short rib and therefore not super tender, but it does tend to char up really nicely and can be quite delicious. Now let's move on to the other side, which is closer to the back of the animal and directly next to the strip loin. This side really only has three distinct areas. We have the cap right here, but as you can see, it is a lot smaller than the other side. We have a really big eye. However, you can also see quite a bit of like cartilage and gnarly bits here. And then of course, we also have the tail. Now I'll go into more detail in a bit, but as you can tell, the better side is always gonna be closer to the front of the animal. Now let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of a ribeye. And as you can see, this one here is completely boneless. Compare that to something like a tomahawk ribeye, which of course has the bone. We have that whole ribeye muscle right here, and then that long rib bone below. You can see on the whole rib roast how it kind of lines up like so. You'll also notice here how that bone is completely clean, but typically this is where you'll find the short rib. So before it's trimmed, this is more so the shape of how it would look. But keep in mind, the ribeye is super tender, while a short rib is a lot more tough. That's why they're typically separated due to different cooking processes. But is it worth buying a ribeye with that bone still attached, or is it a complete waste of money? That's what we're gonna figure out later. The last thing I'll mention here is the ribeye cap, which in this case has been completely removed. The cap sits right over the ribeye, and you can sometimes find it trimmed up just like this. It's gonna be a bit more expensive, but definitely worth giving a shot at least once. And next up, we'll talk about how to select the perfect ribeye. And for me, I like to keep it simple, and I just have two things that I look at. The first thing we're gonna think about is marbling. When we talk about marbling, we're talking about intramuscular fat. A lot of steaks are gonna have fat on the outside, but that is not what we're talking about. Marbling or intramuscular fat are these flecks of fat that are literally inside the muscle, aka intramuscular. They're gonna be responsible for incredible juiciness and flavor. This right here is a Wagyu A5 ribeye, and as you'd expect, there's just an insane amount of marbling in here, and that's why they're so expensive. But now let's compare these two choice grade ribeyes, which is more of an apples to apples comparison. On this one, there's great marbling, whereas this one over here isn't terrible, but there is a lot less. So anytime you're comparing steaks at the grocery store, try to choose the one that has the most of that marbling. Now, the second thing I always look for is the size of the cap. The cap is almost non-existent, which tells us this ribeye was taken towards the back of the animal, and I would almost never choose this ribeye. Compare that to this guy right here, which has a huge cap. But in general, if you can find a steak that looks just like this, you're gonna be good to go. And it is just about time to cook, but first, let's take a look at all the different types of ribeyes. It does tend to get a little bit confusing, especially when you go to the grocery store and you see so many things that are essentially the same cut. And first up is the boneless ribeye. This is how you're typically gonna find a ribeye. Usually gonna be cut anywhere from probably a ½ an inch to an inch and a half in thickness, and this one went for $12.98 a pound. Next, we'll move on to our ribeye steaks that still have the bone. And the first one here is known as the bone-in ribeye. This one went for $11.98 a pound, so actually a little bit cheaper than the boneless, and they're typically gonna be cut about an inch in thickness. The bone is still attached, but it isn't the whole bone, meaning the butcher sliced through bone to get to this point. There's also no bone sticking out above the steak. And next up, we have the cowboy steak. Believe it or not, these were all from the same store, but this one went for $14.98 a pound, which is way more than the previous two, and the only real difference is that it's thicker. Cowboy steaks are usually gonna be at least an inch and a half, maybe closer to 2 in this case, and they usually have a bit of bone sticking out at the top that's Frenched like so. It's only really different from the previous in that it still includes the entire bone, and the butcher doesn't slice through it. Is this worth the extra $2 or $3 a pound compared to the previous two? In my opinion, absolutely not. And next up we have the one and only tomahawk steak. Believe it or not, this is actually the cheapest steak per pound compared to the previous three at $12.48. However, depending on the store, it'll oftentimes be more expensive. It's usually going to be the same thickness as the previous cowboy steak and also still have the entirety of the bone. Now we'll move on to our rib roasts. Starting with the boneless that came in at $9.98 a pound, which is the cheapest so far, and that sort of makes sense because it's essentially just a ribeye that hasn't been trimmed yet. All we would have to do is take this roast, slice it up, and we would get our boneless ribeyes. Moving over to our bone-in rib roast. Now, sort of surprisingly, this one comes in at $13.48 a pound, which is a full 35% more expensive than the boneless one, and they came from the same store. The only difference is that this one still has those bones attached. Now, yes, these look great for presentation, but are those bones really worth an extra 35%?
That one's debatable.
Okay, and for a little bonus steak, we have this little shrimpy guy right here, which is technically sort of a ribeye. This is something I've been dry aging, but really all it is the ribeye without the cap. Now, sometimes you'll see this in restaurants sold as like a queen ribeye. In my opinion, if you're gonna get a ribeye, make sure the cap is still attached. Now, speaking of the cap, this is something we've talked about a little bit in this video, but this right here is the best of the best. This one went for $44.98 at the same store as the rest of these steaks, so a lot more expensive, but also a lot better. Okay, and now that we know the price of each steak, and we also know what each type of ribeye is, the next step is to figure out how to cook them, and I'm gonna show you my favorite method for each. Okay, and steak number one is our boneless ribeye. Now I'm gonna show you guys two of my favorite methods to cook it, and the first is thinly sliced. When cutting steaks thinly, I actually like to throw the steak in the freezer for maybe 20-30 minutes, just to let it firm up a bit to allow for easier slicing. What we're doing here is actually making a Philly cheesesteak. This is easily one of my favorite sandwiches, and if you're gonna do it right, you have to use ribeye. It is a premium cut for a sandwich, but I think it's worth it. And notice how easy it is for me to slice with it partially frozen. Next, we're gonna get our pan super hot and add a high smoke point oil. We'll add in the beef, and the focus here is to get a great crust before overcooking it, so be sure to spread them out, and again, keep that heat high. Seasoning with McCormick Grill Mates coarse black pepper and flake salt. Flip, and notice the great color we've developed, even in a short period of time. When the beef is 75% of the way done, we'll add back in some cooked onions and peppers, a bit of Worcestershire for more color and flavor, and of course, a bunch of cheese. Get that all mixed up and add the mixture to your bun, making sure to do so before you overcook that beef. And just check out that cheesiness. Super simple to throw together, but absolutely delicious, especially because we used a premium cut like ribeye. Now, as much as I am absolutely dying of hunger right now, we're gonna save the taste test until the very end. Let's move on to the next steak. For our next preparation for the boneless ribeye, we are gonna keep it more traditional and pan sear it. I'm gonna show you exactly how to perfectly butter baste a ribeye. First step, we need to season the steak. Now, this is a premium cut of meat, so we wanna use high quality seasonings, but also keep it simple so we can taste the meat. Today I'm using McCormick Grill Mates coarse black pepper and flake salt. Easily my favorite Grill Mates blend. It's my new go-to for beef. Salt, pepper, and garlic based, but filled with perfect flavors and textures. For a good steak, this is really all you need. This is a pretty thick cut, so I season liberally and get a cast iron super hot. Add a good amount of oil. I'm using avocado due to the high smoke point, and lay down the steak. Before flipping, we want to give the steak a good amount of time to develop that crust, at which point we flip and do the same thing on the other side. A beautiful crust has been set, at which point we can start to flip a bit more frequently. And now it's time to baste. Add in the butter, garlic, rosemary, and thyme. A common issue when it comes to butter basting is the butter burning. That's why it's super important to use at least a third of a stick. This will allow you to keep the heat relatively high, allowing our butter to bubble and fizz just like this. If the butter isn't hot enough, it'll just wipe away the crust. Continue basting, flavoring the steak, and also cooking it from all sides until it reaches about 120 internal. Let it rest for about 10 minutes, surrounded by those herbs and butter, at which point it's time to slice. And as you can see, we've hit a perfect medium rare. Unlike something like filet, ribeye does have a bit more fat and intramuscular fibers, so cooking it closer to medium actually isn't a bad idea. But this right here looks perfect.
No, you gotta wait till the end.
All right, let's move on. Our next steak is the bone-in ribeye, and I'm gonna show you how to perfectly cook this on a gas grill. First step, I'm gonna add a thin oil binder. Not only is this gonna help the seasoning stick, but it's also gonna help us develop a crust on that grill. Once again, seasoning with McCormick Grill Mates coarse black pepper and flake salt, which is perfect with this cooking method. And time to get it on the grill. Whenever I'm cooking on the gas grill, I like to have a cool zone as well as a hot zone. But in this case, we're going directly on the hot side. A common issue with gas grills is they actually don't get hot enough to develop a great crust. That's why, unless the steak is super thick, I like to keep the cooking pretty much only on the hot side, and reverse searing is usually not necessary. Flip every 30 seconds or so, maintaining that high heat to develop the crust. Now towards the end, I do like to sometimes add a little bit of herb butter over the top, just for a little extra flavor, and it does kind of help those flames pop to finish up that sear. And once we've reached 120 F internal, it's time to take it inside. Even though we cook this on a gas grill, we've still managed to develop a pretty beautiful looking crust. Remove the bone and time to slice. Now I cooked this one a little closer to rare than medium rare, but honestly, that's not a problem at all for this household. You know, sometimes I feel like the gas grill gets a bad rap, but if done correctly, you can develop some incredible flavors, not to mention it is super convenient.
Not yet.
And moving on to our cowboy ribeye. I'm gonna show you how to do a reverse sear in the oven, perfect for a thick steak like this. Thick steaks can take a lot of seasoning, so feel free to go heavy, getting both sides as well as the edges. Next, we'll throw it in a low temp oven around 250 Fahrenheit to reverse sear. All this means is we'll slowly bring up the internal temp first before searing, which leads to edge doneness. With the steak cooked, now we'll sear over high heat. This can be done on a cast iron or even a grill. We just want ripping hot heat. The result is even the thickest steaks cooked with a perfect edge-to-edge medium rare.
Not today, mister.
And next up, we have the whole rib roast. I'm gonna show you guys how to make a perfect smoked prime rib, and it's actually super simple. Prime rib has a layer of silver skin that I always remove. It's really tough and just not ideal. Next, gently tie it up to maintain its shape, and so that the ribeye cap doesn't pull backwards. Once again, using McCormick Grill Mates cracked pepper and flake salt for beautiful color and texture, seasoning heavily. For even more flavor, we'll make a simple compound butter with just some butter and herbs, mixing well. Smother that all over the prime rib like you're frosting a cake, and get it in a 250F smoker, though even an oven works great too. Once the roast hits 125F, we've developed great color as we're layering flavors with that seasoning and compound butter. Slicing into it, we have a really nice medium rare, and because it's a rib roast, this cut always ends up juicy. And just because we can, we'll throw on some of those buttery drippings right over the top, and that right there is perfection.
Max!
Well, we have made it. It is finally time to cook our tomahawk ribeye. Now, before we figure out how much the bone weighs, how much the bone costs, I'm first gonna show you guys my absolute favorite way to cook a thick steak, and in this case a tomahawk, reverse seared on the smoker. Oil binder, then season heavily on all sides. Of course, need our applewood chunk, and just like the gas grill, we want a hot side and a cold side, placing the steak on the cold side to start the reverse sear. With tomahawk number 1 on the grill, it's time to figure out if this steak is a ripoff or not. First thing we need to do is get the weight of our steak, and it is exactly 1,048 grams. Next, what I'm about to do feels pretty much illegal, but I need to remove the steak from the bone. And I'm keeping my knife pretty close to the bone because I really only want to see the difference between the bone weight and any of the meat. We have our bone removed, and it's time to see how much it weighs. Drum roll, please. 246 over 1048. That is just under 25%. So what this means is that the bone accounts for about 25% of the weight of a tomahawk ribeye. And in terms of price, that essentially means you're paying 30% more than you normally would for the amount of meat that you're getting. So clearly, strictly from a money standpoint, it is absolutely not worth buying a tomahawk. So does that mean we should never buy tomahawk ribeyes? Not necessarily, and I'll explain why during the taste test. Let's check on that ribeye. It's reached about 120 Fahrenheit internal, so it's time to sear. Aggressive heat is gonna give us great flavor, flipping frequently. And this part should only take about 30 seconds per side. The result is a nice charry bark, and slicing into it, we have that beautiful edge-to-edge medium rare. In my opinion, this right here is the perfect steak. What does Tibby think? Tibby, time for steak? Not yet, Tibby. We gotta wait until the taste test. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, it is finally time for the taste test. So let's start over here with our cheesesteak. phenomenal. Using ribeye is just key when you make a cheesesteak. Boneless ribeye. I've eaten that probably 1,000 times. I'll eat that at least 1,000 more times in my life. Next up, bone-in ribeye. Very good, pretty much identical to the one before it. Now, common misconception is that the bone provides more flavor. That myth has been completely debunked. Even though the cooking process was different, those two steaks are identical. Reverse sear cowboy steak in the oven. As expected, very similar to the last two steaks, smoked prime rib. That smoke adds a whole new dimension to it. And last but not least, we have our tomahawk ribeye, reverse seared over charcoal. That one is
by far my favorite.
Completely different flavor from the last ones, and it all has to do with the fact that we cooked it over charcoal, the best way to do it. But the answer to the question we have all been waiting for, is the tomahawk ribeye worth it? Now we know it's 30% more expensive. Here's a few things going for it. One, cooking a tomahawk ribeye over coals is one of humanity's greatest pleasures. Two, when you bring a tomahawk ribeye to the table, it is guaranteed to impress. And three, possibly the most important, you get to eat the meat right off the bone like so. And everybody knows that meat right off the bone just tastes better. So at the end of the day, maybe the tomahawk is not the type of steak you buy for an everyday meal, but once in a while, in my opinion, it is 1000% worth it. It's just too much fun to cook and eat. Well, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did learn something, be sure to like it, maybe drop a comment down there, and I'll see you next time.